In the 1980s, these country stars weren't just successful, they were everywhere. Their songs dominated radio, their faces filled magazine covers, and their voices defined an era when country music crossed into the mainstream like never before. But as the decade faded, so did their presence. Changing tastes, industry shifts, and quiet personal choices pushed many of these once huge names out of the spotlight. Tonight, on the Country Rewind, we revisit 10 country stars who ruled the 80s, then slowly vanished. 1. Eddie Rabbitt. In the early 1980s, Eddie Rabbitt wasn't just successful, he was unavoidable. His songs dominated country radio, crossed effortlessly into pop charts, and turned him into one of the decade's most bankable stars. Tracks like I Love a Rainy Night and Driving My Life Away didn't just top the charts. They captured the sound of an era when country music polished itself for mainstream America. At his peak, Rabbitt was selling millions, headlining major tours, and collecting #1 hits at a pace few could match. What made Eddie Rabbitt especially powerful was his ability to straddle two worlds. He was a country traditionalist at heart, but he understood hooks, production, and crossover appeal better than almost anyone. For a moment, it seemed like he had cracked the code: success without limits, radio without borders. But the warning signs arrived quietly. By the mid to late 80s, country music began to shift. Audiences and radio programmers slowly turned toward a rougher, more traditional sound. Artists associated with slick pop country suddenly felt out of place. Rabbitt's later albums didn't flop dramatically. They simply underperformed. And in the music industry, that distinction is fatal. As radio support faded, so did promotional budgets. Fewer spins meant fewer sales, fewer bookings, and less visibility. Rabbitt kept recording, kept touring, and kept believing the pendulum might swing back. But the industry had already moved on. New faces, new sounds, and a new generation were taking over, leaving little room for yesterday's hitmakers. Then came the most devastating blow: his health. In the early 90s, Eddie Rabbitt was diagnosed with lung cancer. While he continued to work when he could, the disease drained both his energy and momentum. By the time of his passing in 1998, his name had already begun to fade from the public conversation. Today, Eddie Rabbitt is remembered mostly through a handful of timeless songs, often divorced from the massive career that once surrounded them. His disappearance wasn't loud or scandalous. It was quiet, gradual, and painfully typical of how the country music machine treats even its biggest stars when the spotlight shifts away. Juice Newton. At the dawn of the 1980s, Juice Newton represented the future of country music. Her voice was unmistakable, her image approachable, and her sound perfectly positioned between country warmth and pop accessibility. Songs like Queen of Hearts, Angel of the Morning, and The Sweetest Thing didn't just climb the charts, they crossed boundaries. She was played on country stations, pop stations, and adult contemporary radio at the same time, a rare achievement that made her one of the decade's defining crossover stars. For a few crucial years, Juice Newton was everywhere. She won major awards, sold millions of records, and became a symbol of how country music could dominate the mainstream without losing its emotional core. Unlike many of her peers, she wasn't chasing pop success. It found her naturally. And for a moment, it seemed like she had secured a permanent place at the top. But that crossover success carried a hidden cost. As the 80s progressed, country radio began to draw lines. Artists were expected to pick a side. For programmers pushing a return to traditional sounds, Juice Newton's polished production and pop appeal suddenly became liabilities. She wasn't rejected outright, she was slowly sidelined. Her later singles charted lower. Radio spins declined. The industry narrative shifted from crossover phenomenon to artist who no longer fits the format. Juice continued recording strong material, but without radio support, even quality songs struggled to survive. There was no scandal, no dramatic collapse, just a gradual closing of doors. At the same time, a new generation was emerging. Younger artists with rougher edges and clearer country identities began to dominate. In comparison, Juice Newton's sound felt tied to a specific moment, unmistakably 80s, but no longer in demand. By the early 90s, her presence in the mainstream had largely vanished. She stepped away from the spotlight, focusing on touring smaller venues and later on personal priorities, including health challenges that further limited her public profile. Today, Juice Newton's legacy lives through a handful of iconic songs that still spark instant recognition. Yet many listeners are surprised to learn just how big she once was. Her story isn't about failure. It's about how quickly the country music industry can abandon even its brightest stars once they no longer fit the sound of the moment. 3. T.G. Sheppard. During the late 1970s and throughout much of the 1980s, T.G. Sheppard was one of the most reliable hitmakers in country music. While other artists chased trends, Sheppard quietly built one of the most impressive runs on the charts. With a string of #1 singles that seemed endless, he became a fixture on country radio, a familiar voice audiences trusted, and a name record labels relied on for consistent success. What set T.G. Sheppard apart was not flash or controversy, but precision. His songs were cleanly produced, emotionally accessible, and perfectly tailored for radio. Tracks like Last Cheater's Waltz, Slow Burn, and I Loved 'Em Every One defined the polished, romantic sound of early 80s country. For years, it worked flawlessly. He wasn't just popular, he was dependable. And in the music industry, dependability can be priceless. But that same polish became his weakness. As the decade moved forward, country music experienced a philosophical shift. By the late 80s, the neo-traditional movement was gaining momentum, pushing artists who emphasized rawness, roots, and authenticity over smooth production. Suddenly, the sound that had once guaranteed Sheppard chart success began to feel out of step with where the genre was headed. Unlike artists who crashed suddenly, Sheppard's decline was subtle. His singles still charted, but not at the top. Airplay slowly decreased. The excitement that once surrounded each new release faded. There was no scandal, no career-ending moment, just a steady erosion of relevance. Industry priorities changed as well. Labels redirected attention and budgets toward younger artists who fit the new traditional mold. For veterans like Sheppard, that meant fewer promotional pushes and less radio support. Even a strong song could no longer overcome shifting tastes. By the early 1990s, T.G. Sheppard was no longer part of the mainstream conversation. He continued performing, recording selectively, and maintaining a loyal fan base, but his days as a chart-dominating force were over. Today, his name rarely comes up when discussing the giants of country music, despite his extraordinary run of #1 hits. T.G. Sheppard didn't vanish because he failed. He vanished because the genre evolved, and there was suddenly no room left for the sound he had mastered. Sylvia. For a brief but unforgettable moment in the early 1980s, Sylvia felt like the next great promise of country music. Her breakout hit Nobody exploded onto the charts in 1982, climbing to #1 and instantly defining her image. Elegant, emotional, and unmistakably of its time. The song's polished production and aching vulnerability captured exactly what early 80s country audiences were craving. And Sylvia suddenly found herself at the center of the genre's mainstream push. Unlike many of her peers, Sylvia didn't rely on novelty or gimmicks. Her appeal was subtle. She projected poise rather than excess, emotion rather than spectacle. With follow-up hits like Nothing Ever Happened and Drifter, she built a reputation as a serious vocalist with crossover potential. For a few years, she was a regular presence on radio, television, and award show stages, a name that seemed destined for longevity. But Sylvia's rise coincided with one of the most unstable periods in country music history. By the mid-80s, the genre was beginning to fracture. Pop country acts were thriving, but beneath the surface, a backlash was forming. Traditionalists were growing louder, and radio programmers began preparing for a course correction. Artists whose sound was closely tied to early 80s polish suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Sylvia was one of them. Her later releases didn't fail outright. They simply didn't connect with a rapidly changing audience. Singles charted lower, airplay thinned, the industry's enthusiasm cooled. Without massive radio support, even strong material struggled to survive. There was no dramatic turning point, just a steady quieting of attention. What makes Sylvia's disappearance particularly striking is how complete it felt. Unlike some artists who lingered in the background, she stepped away almost entirely. By the late 80s, she had withdrawn from the mainstream spotlight, choosing a private life over fighting an industry that no longer seemed interested in her sound. In later years, Sylvia resurfaced only occasionally, often surprising fans who remembered her as a defining voice of their youth. Many were stunned to realize how short her time at the top had been. Today, Sylvia is remembered less as a fallen star and more as a moment, a voice that perfectly captured a specific chapter in country music history before quietly slipping away. Her story isn't about scandal or failure, but about timing, transition, and how unforgiving the industry can be to artists caught between eras. Ronnie Milsap. By the time the 1980s arrived, Ronnie Milsap was already a giant. Few artists in country music history navigated the line between country and pop as successfully as he did. Blind since birth, Milsap built a career defined by emotional depth, technical brilliance, and an uncanny instinct for radio-friendly hits. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, he dominated the charts with songs like Smoky Mountain Rain, I Wouldn't Have Missed It for the World, and Any Day Now. At his peak, he wasn't just successful, he was untouchable. What made Ronnie Milsap extraordinary was his versatility. He could deliver traditional country heartbreak, smooth pop ballads, and soulful crossover tracks without losing credibility. For years, radio embraced him as the perfect bridge between genres. Awards followed, sales soared, and his voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in American music. But dominance can create an illusion of permanence. As the 80s progressed, the country industry began to change its priorities. Younger artists emerged with a sharper image and a more traditional sound. The neo-traditional movement gained momentum, and suddenly the polished, adult contemporary leaning style that Milsap had mastered felt out of sync with where country music wanted to go. Unlike some artists who fell abruptly, Milsap's decline was gradual and almost invisible. His singles still charted, but fewer reached number one. Airplay slowly declined. Albums sold respectably, but not spectacularly. The industry didn't reject him, it simply stopped centering him. For an artist accustomed to the spotlight, that shift was devastating in its subtlety. There were also personal challenges. Health issues and family responsibilities began to pull his focus away from relentless touring and promotion. While he continued recording and performing, the pace slowed, and with it, his visibility. In a business driven by momentum, slowing down often means being left behind. By the early 1990s, Ronnie Milsap was no longer a defining force in the genre. He remained respected, admired, and warmly remembered, but the era of chart domination was over. New stars had taken his place, and the industry rarely looked back. Today, Milsap is rightly regarded as a legend, yet many listeners underestimate just how massive he once was. His story illustrates a harsh truth of country music. Even extraordinary talent and decades of success offer no immunity when the sound of the genre moves on without you. 6. Crystal Gayle. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Crystal Gayle embodied elegance in country music. With her signature long hair, smooth delivery, and polished production, she became one of the genre's most recognizable crossover stars. Songs like Don't It Make My Brown Eyes Blue, Talking in Your Sleep, and Why Have You Left the One You Left Me For turned her into a household name, not just among country fans, but across mainstream America. For a time, Crystal Gayle represented how refined and accessible country music could be. Her success was no accident. Gayle's voice was warm and controlled, perfectly suited to the softer, pop-leaning sound that dominated radio during the early 80s. She wasn't chasing trends. She was defining them. Record sales were strong, award nominations piled up, and her image became inseparable from the era's idea of sophistication. In an industry often driven by excess, Crystal Gayle thrived on restraint. But that refinement would later become a liability. As the 1980s drew to a close, country music began to undergo a sharp identity shift. The genre started reclaiming grit, tradition, and raw emotion. Younger artists with rougher edges and more traditional influences were gaining favor, and radio programmers followed suit. The smooth, adult contemporary sheen that once propelled Gayle to the top now felt out of step with the direction country music was heading. Her later releases weren't poorly received, they were simply ignored. Singles charted modestly, airplay declined, and promotional support weakened. The industry didn't turn on Crystal Gayle. It quietly moved past her. Without the momentum of radio, even an established star struggled to maintain visibility. Unlike some of her peers, Gayle didn't fight the shift aggressively. She continued to record selectively, tour consistently, and maintain a loyal fan base, especially outside the United States. Yet her role in the mainstream conversation diminished rapidly. By the early 1990s, she was no longer viewed as a current force in country music, but as a respected figure from a previous era. Today, Crystal Gayle is remembered fondly, often nostalgically, as the voice of a softer chapter in country history. What's frequently overlooked is just how dominant she once was, and how swiftly that dominance faded once the genre decided to redefine itself. Her story is a reminder that in country music, elegance can shine brightly, but it rarely survives unchanged when tradition comes roaring back. K.T. Oslin's rise in the late 1980s was unlike anything country music had seen before. She didn't arrive as a fresh-faced newcomer in her 20s. Instead, she broke through in her mid-40s, armed with sharp songwriting, lived emotion, and a perspective that felt radically different from the genre's norms. When 80s Ladies hit radio in 1987, it wasn't just a song, it was a statement. Oslin gave a voice to women who had lived, lost, loved, and survived, and country audiences responded immediately. Her success was swift and undeniable. 80s Ladies, Do Ya, and I'll Always Come Back climbed the charts, earning major awards and critical acclaim. Oslin wasn't just popular, she was respected. At a time when much of country music focused on youth and nostalgia, her lyrics were contemporary, conversational, and unapologetically adult. For a brief period, she felt like a necessary evolution of the genre. But that uniqueness also made her vulnerable. K.T. Oslin's appeal was deeply tied to a specific cultural moment in the late 80s, when country music briefly embraced sophisticated adult storytelling. As the industry transitioned into the 1990s, priorities shifted again. The new decade favored younger artists, stronger visual branding, and a return to more traditional or arena-ready sounds. Oslin's reflective, dialogue-driven style suddenly felt out of place. Her later releases didn't collapse, they simply struggled to find oxygen. Radio support softened, chart positions slipped. The industry's enthusiasm cooled as labels invested heavily in the next generation of stars. Oslin continued to write and record, but without aggressive promotion, her presence faded quickly from the mainstream. There were also personal factors. Health issues and a desire to step back from the relentless demands of the industry led her to slow down. Unlike artists who fought to reclaim relevance, Oslin chose a quieter path. She appeared occasionally, acted in film and television, and remained admired by peers. But her time as a chart force was over. Today, K.T. Oslin is remembered as a brilliant anomaly, a late bloomer who proved that honesty and maturity could still conquer country radio, even if only briefly. Her disappearance wasn't the result of failure, but of an industry that once again narrowed its definition of who belonged at the center. In that sense, her story is both inspiring and quietly tragic. 8. In the early 1980s, Lee Greenwood achieved something most country artists only dream of. He became inseparable from a national moment. With a powerful voice and a string of solid country hits, Greenwood was already a respected figure on radio. But in 1984, everything changed. God Bless the USA transformed him from a successful country singer into a symbol of American patriotism. The song resonated far beyond the genre, embedding itself into political events, national ceremonies, and moments of collective emotion. For a time, that association was enormously powerful. Greenwood enjoyed chart success, high visibility, and a profile that extended well outside Nashville. He wasn't just an artist. He was a voice tied to identity and national pride. Few country singers of the era reached that level of cultural recognition. Yet that same defining hit slowly became a double-edged sword. As the decade moved on, Lee Greenwood's broader catalog began to disappear behind the shadow of one song. Radio programmers and audiences increasingly associated his name with patriotism rather than contemporary country music. While other artists reinvented themselves or adapted to shifting trends, Greenwood became frozen in a specific image: powerful, respected, but narrow. By the late 80s and early 90s, country music was evolving rapidly. The genre leaned toward younger artists, fresh sounds, and personalities that fit a changing radio landscape. Greenwood's traditional, message-driven image no longer aligned with what mainstream country radio wanted to promote. His newer singles struggled to gain traction, not because they lacked quality, but because they couldn't escape comparison to the anthem that defined him. Instead of fighting that identity, Greenwood leaned into it. He focused more on live performances tied to national events, military audiences, and patriotic celebrations. While this kept him visible, it also removed him from the competitive heart of the country charts. Gradually, his presence in mainstream country music faded. Today, Lee Greenwood is still widely recognized, but almost exclusively for a single song. Many listeners are surprised to learn how active and successful he was beyond that anthem. His career didn't collapse, it narrowed. And in the process, he quietly vanished from the evolving story of country music itself. Greenwood's story is a reminder that in country music, even a song that makes you immortal can, paradoxically, push the rest of your career into the background. Baillie and the Boys. In the late 1980s, Baillie and the Boys seemed perfectly positioned for long-term success. At a time when country music was opening its doors to polished vocal groups, the trio stood out with tight harmonies, radio-friendly production, and an image that felt modern without straying too far from tradition. Songs like Oh Heart, She's Got a Single Thing in Mind, and Long Shot climbed the charts quickly, making the group one of the most promising acts of the era. For a brief period, Baillie and the Boys were everywhere. Radio embraced them, labels invested heavily, and audiences responded warmly. They represented a softer, melodic side of late 80s country, emotionally accessible, carefully produced, and perfectly suited for mainstream airplay. In an industry dominated by solo stars, their success felt refreshing and slightly unexpected. But timing would ultimately work against them. As the 1980s came to a close, country music entered one of its most aggressive transitions. The early 1990s ushered in a new wave of artists who emphasized individuality, grit, and strong personal branding. Solo performers with clear identities became the industry's priority, while vocal groups began to lose favor almost overnight. For Baillie and the Boys, the shift was brutal in its quietness. Their later singles struggled to gain the same level of airplay. Radio formats tightened. Promotional support weakened. There was no scandal, no dramatic breakup that captured headlines, just a gradual disappearance from the playlists that once sustained them. Another challenge was visibility. Unlike solo artists who could reinvent themselves individually, groups depended heavily on collective momentum. When that momentum stalled, there was little room to pivot. By the early 1990s, the industry had largely moved on, and Baillie and the Boys were no longer part of the mainstream conversation. The group eventually disbanded, and its members stepped away from the spotlight. Unlike many former stars, they didn't linger on nostalgia circuits or attempt major comebacks. Their legacy remained tied almost entirely to a narrow window of late 80s success. Today, Baillie and the Boys are often remembered as a footnote, a name that sparks recognition but little detail. Yet their story captures an important truth about country music's evolution. Sometimes it isn't talent or popularity that determines survival, but whether an artist's format still fits the industry's vision. When that vision changes, even rising stars can vanish almost overnight. 10. Earl Thomas Conley. In the early to mid-1980s, Earl Thomas Conley was one of the most influential voices in country music, even if his name never carried the flash of some of his peers. With a smooth, conversational delivery and emotionally layered songwriting, Conley helped define what modern country radio sounded like during the decade. Songs like Holding Her and Loving You, Fire and Smoke, and What I'd Say didn't just reach number one. They reshaped expectations of how intimate, restrained, and adult country music could be. Conley's strength was subtlety. He rarely relied on big hooks or dramatic production. Instead, his songs felt lived in, reflective, and quietly devastating. At a time when country music leaned heavily into polish, he brought emotional complexity that resonated deeply with listeners. Industry insiders respected him, radio trusted him, and for years, his presence on the charts felt inevitable. But that very subtlety became a liability as the genre shifted. By the late 1980s, country music was preparing for a new era, louder, younger, and more image-driven. The coming wave favored artists with sharper identities and more traditional or stadium-ready sounds. In comparison, Conley's introspective style felt understated, even invisible. His decline wasn't sudden. Singles continued to chart, but their impact softened. Airplay declined quietly. Label enthusiasm cooled. Without the push of radio and promotion, his carefully crafted songs struggled to reach the same audience they once had. Unlike artists who tried to chase trends, Conley remained artistically consistent, a decision that preserved his integrity, but cost him relevance. Then, in a move that surprised many, Earl Thomas Conley stepped away. By the early 1990s, he had largely withdrawn from recording and touring, choosing privacy over a fight for attention in an industry that no longer rewarded his strengths. There was no farewell tour, no comeback attempt, just silence. In later years, health issues further removed him from public life. By the time of his death in 2019, his influence was mostly remembered by musicians and devoted fans rather than the broader audience he once commanded. Today, Earl Thomas Conley is often described as a songwriter-singer, deeply respected, quietly influential, and largely forgotten by mainstream listeners. His story may be the most fitting end to this list, a reminder that in country music, even those who help shape an era can disappear when the industry decides to move on without them.